Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. And welcome to the second episode of my newer series, Work in Progress, where I take a look at betas and prototypes of popular games to see how they changed from their early days of development to the final product. For this episode, I'll be looking at 4 different versions of Street Fighter II on the Genesis/Mega Drive. A very early prototype of Street Fighter II Champion Edition, another prototype from about 4 months later, and then the next prototype from where no one knows the exact date it came out, but the name had been updated to Street Fighter II Turbo, and then the final retail release that had been named Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition, so we can see how everything changed. Now for this series, I go a little bit more in-depth than some others, so we're going to take a look at some hardware information, we're going to take a look at a little bit of the game's history, we'll talk a little bit about how it compares and what the market was like at the time it came out, and all of that fun stuff. Alright, that's enough setup, let's get on with it. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty of the game itself, here's a few technical details about the Genesis/Mega Drive hardware, which will help explain some differences and changes we see in different versions. First up, the Genesis can do 2 full tile map layers and a sprite layer in hardware, which means it can do a host of hardware-based parallax effects. It also has a special graphical window layer for stuff that will generally stay still on the screen. I'll be referring to these things a few times throughout. The system can show 64 colors on the screen at once. Really, it's only 61 once the transparent colors in a palette are considered, and it works with 4 palettes of 16 colors each. The system has a total palette of 512 colors. And yes, I know you can get more with shadow and highlight modes, but those won't apply to this game. And next up, sound. I've done a pretty comprehensive video on how sound works on the Genesis, which I'll link in the description here. I've also done a big tutorial series on how to create sound and music for the system, but I'm going to sum up just the relevant bits of everything super quickly here. So the Genesis has 2 sound chips that can produce a combined total of 10 channels of sound under normal circumstances, but considerably more under special circumstances. The Yamaha YM2612 found in the Genesis can produce either 6 channels of FM synthesis or 5 channels of FM synthesis and 1 channel of digital audio samples or recordings. By adjusting some elements via software, it's possible to get the digital to analog converter, or DAC, of the YM2612 to play more than 1 sample at a time. In addition to that, the Genesis also sports an SN76489 PSG sound chip. This is the same sound chip found in the Sega Master System. That was in there because the Genesis has backwards compatibility with the Master System. You really only needed the power-based converter to accept the SMS cartridge shape and pins and everything. Now, the SN76489, which I'm just going to call the PSG from now on, can operate in 2 different major modes. In the first mode, it can produce 3 square wave channels, which are sort of a flat electronic sound that you'd hear in 8-bit games and toys and stuff back in the early 80s. In addition to that, in the first mode, it could also produce noise in 3 different tones, with noise generated in one of 2 ways. In the second major mode the PSG operated in, it could produce only 2 square wave channels and 1 noise channel, again with a selection of noise type. But this time, instead of just having 3 noise tones, the noise would support as many octaves as the square waves. And with that, we will begin our little journey today with a look at how Street Fighter II, which was an arcade phenomenon without compare at its time of release, ended up on the Genesis/Mega Drive. Seriously, Street Fighter II single-handedly revived the flagging arcade scene back in the day. It was monstrously popular, and with good reason, it was one of the best games ever made. Now, Capcom originally released a port of the first Street Fighter II for the SNES, and it was very well received, and it sold huge back in the day. It was a really solid conversion for the time it came out, and the fact that the SNES was the only system you could play it on probably helped Nintendo move more than a few systems back then. Obviously, anyone with a hardware platform wanted a Street Fighter II game on their system. In the arcades, there had been a modified, newer version of Street Fighter II called Street Fighter II Champion Edition. It recolored the backgrounds, added a second color for each character, allowed 2 players to pick the same character, which the original game did not. With one minor exception, on the SNES, you could enter a code into its versus mode to do the same thing. The game also featured tweaked movesets for the characters, tweaked a few graphics, and made the 4 boss characters playable for the first time ever. And it would be this version of Street Fighter II Champion Edition that would end up on the PC Engine, and it was also supposed to be Street Fighter II Champion Edition that ended up on the Genesis/Mega Drive, but fate would later intervene. On March 10th of 1993, Capcom and Sega announced their new partnership that would bring Street Fighter II to the Genesis in June of 1993 via a press release and a press event called the Breakfast of Champions. Yeah, for real. You might think Capcom and Sega already had deals for games on their systems because of stuff like Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, Mercs, and Forgotten Worlds that had already appeared on it. If you think that, well, you're wrong!
wrong!
You see, Sega had a special deal where they programmed those games themselves from the ground up after licensing the titles from Capcom. This new partnership meant that Capcom would develop and publish games on the Genesis for the very first time by themselves, and Street Fighter II Champion Edition was supposed to be the first of many Capcom titles for the system. Now, the standard Genesis controller from the moment of its release was the 3-button control pad. It was great at the time it came out. It was a huge boost in comfort from stuff like the NES and SMS control pads. But as newer arcade games were using more buttons as standard, Sega knew they needed to update the controller for the system. So prior to the release of games like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, they unveiled their answer to the problem, a 6-button gamepad. And let me say, folks, this is one of my favorite game controllers ever made. The D-pad feel is fantastic, and the 2 rows of 3 buttons make fighting games comfortable and easy to play. And when these came out, they were $20. Take that, modern game controllers. Anyway, you could play the upcoming Genesis SF2 games with the 3-button pad, but you'd have to press start to toggle the 3 action buttons between punch and kick. Ugh. The history of Street Fighter II on the Genesis is quite bumpy. Genesis Street Fighter II Champion Edition, as just stated, was originally supposed to release in June of '93. From screenshots and magazines like EGM, which even did a huge spread and reviewed this game that never came out in its May 1993 issue, showed that it looked a smidge rough around the edges and not nearly as polished as the Super Nintendo Street Fighter II. Sure, the SNES had some technical advantages, especially in the area of color, but the screenshot showed in EGM, displayed a game that just looked undercooked. And no shade to EGM, they did wonders with screenshots back in the day, but the ones included in the magazine in this issue were especially blurry for some reason, uncharacteristically so for the magazine. Anyway, despite EGM's favorable review of the game, word trickled down through the gaming media that Capcom wasn't happy with the game internally and had decided it needed some work before its release. And that's where we really begin here. Here's a look at an early prototype of Genesis Street Fighter II Champion Edition from March 1993, and it is very likely similar to what EGM reviewed in that issue. Now, I can't vouch for the veracity of this next bit. I've tried to find the absolute truth for years now, but the word is that this version of Street Fighter II Champion Edition was outsourced to a third-party developer by Capcom. However, no one has ever been able to uncover who that was, if it's true at all. I've seen other rumors say that Sega did a lot of the work in this version, but that is also completely unsubstantiated. So who created this prototype? All I can really say is that we don't know for sure, so I'm just going to continue to attribute it to Capcom. If you happen to know who did this or you worked on it yourself back in the day, feel free to hit up the comments with any links that support what you're saying. And let me address perhaps the biggest and stupidest Street Fighter II on Genesis controversy, the black bar. You'll notice in the screenshots that we saw in EGM and on this video here that the game screen itself, the window that shows gameplay, is pushed down to the bottom of the display, and the HUD featuring the score, energy bars, timer, and character names are at the very top of the screen in a completely black area. Gamers and game journalists back in this era used this fact to criticize the Genesis version of the game and talk about how this version was inferior because of the black bar and blah blah blah. Here's the thing. This is Super Nintendo Street Fighter II now, which was deservedly released to universal acclaim. I loved this game when it came out. But wait a second, what's this? There are black bars at the top and bottom of the screen with nothing in them at all. If you combine the space of those 2 black bars in the SNES version and then move the game window below them, well, what do we get? There's only a very slight difference in the amount of screen real estate used for both versions of the game. And with both versions running at the same resolution, 256 by 224 in NTSC regions, it shows that when Capcom did this, they were just trying to make use of all the negative blank space that had been in the Super Nintendo one. But there was this insane outcry over it, so much so that Capcom had to relent, and they changed this in later prototypes by overlaying the HUD and then including the black area at the top and bottom of the screen, just like in the Super Nintendo version, and that's how the game would release in its final state. And hey, just for the fun of it, let's throw in the PC Engine version and see how it looks and how much of the screen real estate it used compared to the other 2 versions. Kind of strange that you never heard anyone complaining about the black bars in that version, huh? But anyway, let's get back to the prototype here. Visually, one of the first things you may have noticed is that there are more frames of idle animation in this version than either the Super Nintendo or PC Engine versions of Street Fighter II that came out around the same time. And let me zoom in and slow this down for you so you can see how clear it is. It's pretty nice, right? Now, since this was just a prototype and not a final game, as you'd expect, not everything was fully done here yet, and some of the animation for just moving around the screen was a little bit janky, and that would all be corrected in later versions. But one thing that also stands out to me here is that it doesn't look like the character assets were ported over from the SNES art. There are lots of animation frames that look quite a bit different. Some of them are better and some of them are not. Look at Ryu's face here with this wind pose. There is very little detail in it. So this version has some positives and negatives compared to the prior Super Nintendo release. Now the backgrounds here are kind of similar to what we get in the retail version, but there are still some very observable changes between this one and the final release. Look at the colors in Guile's stage, they're quite a bit different. And the same is true of many stages, but perhaps the best example is Blanca's stage here. This one looks a lot different between this prototype and then the final retail release of the game. And some background graphics, like the clouds in Ryu's stage, were hopefully incomplete when we saw them in this prototype, and we would see them change a lot by the time the full retail release came along. Now this prototype does contain all 12 characters and even portions of the endings. Now I haven't played through with every single character, but I haven't seen any complete endings for the characters I have finished it with. With Ryu, for example, you have all the ending text, a portion of the first scene of his ending, but none of the second scene. Instead of having him walk into the sunset with the trees animating on his sides, this game replaces that scene with just his background and with Ryu just standing there with his normal sprite, and then he eventually does a dragon punch. Now let's talk sound. Sound is a big deal in this one. The effects and music are 100% different from the retail release and even some of the other prototypes we're going to see here. The punch and kick sounds, when they don't connect and land a blow, sound really weird in this one and very primitive, and I'm glad that these didn't make it into the final version. I assume they were just placeholders. And let's listen to a few differences here. The voices are here for all the special moves, but they sound a little strange, sometimes too high-pitched. A lot of the impact sounds for when attacks connect are just flat out missing here. And remember all the technical stuff I mentioned about the sound chips? Well, this is where some of that comes into play. Capcom used loads of digital samples for the percussion in the music, which was great. However, since the Genesis can only play one digital sample at a time normally, the percussion tracks would cut out and stop when another digital sound, like say Ryu yelling Hadouken, would play. It really makes this version kind of annoying to listen to. On the plus side, even in the early versions of this game, Street Fighter II Champion Edition for the Genesis had something no fully released 16-bit generation console version of Street Fighter II would receive: the critical versions of each song. Any fans of the original Street Fighter II arcade games know that when one opponent suffers a certain level of damage, the music changes to a critical version of the song, which is a shorter and usually faster version of the song that repeats just a few bars of the main song at a few different pitches, sometimes with emphasis on different instruments. And in the prior SNES release of the original SF2, Capcom simply sped up the normal stage music, which was not the same thing. And it was awesome that this version had this and that it was intended to be in the full release for the Genesis. And sadly, this feature would end up being cut from Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. So you can fully see what I'm talking about here. Check out this comparison of what happens when the critical portion of a round begins in this prototype versus the retail release. Now on the downside, some of the tunes in this version of the game sound worse than the official version we get later, but there are some that do also sound better. But there's more to the game's sound than just its music, special move voices, and impacts. There are lots of other effects and voices in Street Fighter II, like the announcer at the beginning and end of each round, the destination country being called out before traveling to each match, and the sound of the plane when traveling, and more. And well, almost all of that is missing from this early prototype. I'll also note that this version has two bonus stages, the car and the bouncing wooden barrels. It does not have the oil cans from the arcade version, nor the bricks stage from the Super Nintendo version of SF2. When it comes to gameplay, it's already pretty good, even in this early prototype, but it clearly wasn't complete at this stage, as one would expect from a prototype. Now, all the characters' moves and specials are here and everything, but the balancing and the move ranges are not quite right, and they're quite different from the final release of the game. And to illustrate what I'm talking about here, if you use Ryu's medium kick, which usually has a pretty long range, there are several instances in this prototype where it fails to connect in places where it would hit in the final version of the game. As far as the controls go, it feels like maybe it doesn't poll the system for control changes as quickly as the retail release of the game. It feels like it's a little bit slower and the controls are just a tiny bit more sluggish than the full retail release. And for an example of what I mean, it can be a little bit harder to perform those quarter circle or half circle moves for certain characters. And one other thing I can note is that the intro with the two guys punching each other in front of the building, which leads up to the logo, is not present in the game yet. To finish up for this March 1993 prototype, let's take a look at just how a few more stages compare to their final retail versions in Special Champion Edition. A few months later, there was another prototype that found its way onto the good old interwebs. This one's not a whole lot different than the March 93 prototype, so we're going to spend a little bit less time looking at this one. The biggest change here from that original prototype is in the sound department. The sound effects for swinging punches and kicks have completely changed, and they are terrible. Seriously, I'm so glad these didn't make the final cut for the retail release. Visually, this one is still mostly the same as the prior prototype, which is why we're not going to spend as much time on it. But what actually has changed here? There are a few very minor things in the backgrounds that have little tweaks, it seems, but the biggest change is really just those aforementioned sound effects. It's still missing nearly all the voices from outside of fights, including the announcer and the countries and stuff. Some of the music has been changed a little bit with modified instruments, and the critical versions of the songs at this point are still here. Now, the dreaded black bar is still at the top of the screen as well, and the endings in this one are still trimmed just as they were in the March 93 prototype. And I will note that the control still feels a tad sluggish in this one, and if it has changed from the March 93 version, I really can't tell. And really, there's not much more to say about this one. It's very similar to the prior prototype from a few months before. And here's a look at a few stages and characters just so you can confirm that for yourself. The last prototype we're going to look at today is a little different, but not entirely. I don't have a date for this one, but it's after the last two, and it was sometime in '93 before the release of the final game in September. Now this one's a little funny in some ways, so let me explain. The title screen on this one says Street Fighter II Turbo. When you select a character, you can choose between the standard Street Fighter II color and the new color from Street Fighter II Turbo. However, it does not have any of the new moves or balancing that was done for Street Fighter II Turbo. So what you end up with are the Turbo outfit colors, but the normal Champion Edition moveset. In addition to that, you can see, hey, the black bar at the top of the screen is gone. They took the HUD and overlaid it on top of the main game window, just as they did in the Super Nintendo Street Fighter II release. This HUD is made up of a combination of background elements along with some sprites. In this prototype, however, some of the game graphics will show in the bottom black area, which I'm sure was not intentional and is just a glitch, and this problem will be fixed before the final release of the game as Special Champion Edition soon after. Regarding the sound and music, it's mostly similar to the prior July '93 prototype, but there are still some differences and we can hear more punch and kick sounds when they land and connect now, but still not all the time. We also have the digital percussion tracks cut out when there are other samples overriding them, like those Hadoukens and Shoryukens. Some of the music again sounds very slightly tweaked. I've noticed a few sample changes for percussion in some songs here and there, but overall it's still very similar to the prior two prototypes that we looked at. And even at this later stage in development, the critical versions of the songs are still present in this one. So it looks like removing them was kind of a last-minute choice for Capcom, since this prototype can't have been from too long before the game's official September '93 release. Now, other changes include a few more audio samples for different things here and there that were missing from earlier versions, and the endings in this one have actually regressed and are cut down and removed entirely, featuring less details from the endings in the prior prototypes. More important to discuss here is that not too long after the March announcement of Street Fighter II Champion Edition for the Genesis, Capcom had announced that Street Fighter II Turbo was coming to the Super Nintendo, and this had caused a fair amount of outcry among Sega fans at the time. I mean, just picture it, Capcom had just announced a Street Fighter II port for the Genesis, but they followed up in a month or so with announcing a new version of the game would be released for the Super Nintendo, featuring even more stuff than this one that you had just announced about a month ago for the Genesis. Now that, coupled with Capcom's apparent displeasure with the prototypes, would lead to a series of changes that would bring us to the final release of the game, which we'll look at next. Here we are, we're going to wrap this video up with a look at the retail release of Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition and how some things compare to the prototypes. I'm not going to go over how the final retail release compares to the arcade version since I've done a full video on that about 5 years ago, and I'll link to that in the description. I might do a remaster of that soon to modernize it to my current standards so it's more watchable, but still, I'll leave a link to the original, and then if I do a new one, I'll put the link in for that too. Back to the point, let's talk about what's changed in this release from the prototypes, and the answer is an awful lot of stuff. Now, the unsubstantiated lore around this game says that Capcom took over development duties from whoever else they had working on the prototypes to complete the game in-house. So what do we end up with? Essentially, an entirely different game, one with many improvements, but also several regressions. Most importantly, to stem fan dissatisfaction, Capcom included both the Champion Edition and Turbo versions of Street Fighter II in this single cartridge, so it wouldn't fall behind the SNES version of Turbo that had been recently announced. So let's check out that idle animation again. On the left, here's the July 1993 prototype, and on the right, we have the late September release of the actual game. Look at how different the characters look, and look at the reduced animation frames in the idle animation. And one thing that's obvious here is that Capcom at this point took the character sprite assets from the Super Nintendo version of the game, color reduced them for the Genesis, and then inserted them right on into it, which they could do rather easily since the two systems run this game at the same resolution, which as mentioned before is 256 by 224 for NTSC systems. Keep in mind, if you discount the black bar areas, it's really closer to about 256 by 192, give or take a few rows of pixels. So yes, the characters look much different from the prototype and look very similar to their SNES counterparts this time around. And yes, the Genesis did have a resolution of 320 by 224, and most games ran in that mode for NTSC regions, but there were a fair amount of games that ran in the lower Genesis resolution mode like this one. So the backgrounds have undergone some changes here. Blanca's background looks way better in this retail release than it did in any of the prototypes. The colors have changed quite a bit. Same for Guile's stage here, look at that. And they fixed the derpy clouds and Ryu's stage finally. There are lots of little fixes and improvements to the backgrounds, and honestly, just about all of them are for the better. The biggest loss visually in this game from the prototypes comes in the form of some of those cut animation frames, especially during idle animation. Now, what about the sound? Well, there's some good news and some bad news on the sound front. You want the bad news first, right? All the critical versions of the songs have been removed. They're gone. The songs just speed up at the critical phase of battle, just like they did in the prior Super Nintendo release now. All of the music has been completely redone. Some songs sound better, some sound worse. They're all still pretty decent at least. But the songs for Chun-Li, Ryu, Sagat, and some others definitely sounded better in the prototype. Let's move on to the good news. Capcom used a sound driver that allowed them to play more than one digital sample at a time. That means we can hear two characters yell out moves simultaneously, which was not even possible in the arcade version of the game. And the digital percussion track is much more reliable in this version without the drums constantly cutting out. On top of that, the sound effects that play when you execute moves and miss sound way better. And hey, the effects are totally consistent now, and you always hear when you connect and hit somebody. And almost all the announcer speeches here in the final release as well. And then obviously, since this is the full retail release of the game, it does also feature all of the endings. Gameplay-wise, Special Champion Edition feels considerably better than the prototypes. So I mentioned earlier that it felt like the control in the prototypes wasn't being pulled quick enough or often enough, so that it gave the game sort of a sluggish feel. Well, that's completely gone in this full retail release. It is much more responsive, and I'd say it feels like it may even be the most responsive of all the 16-bit era home versions of Street Fighter II. So in the end, while things generally worked out okay, did we get the absolute best version of Street Fighter II or Champion Edition or Turbo on the Genesis that we could have? I would have to say no. Don't misunderstand me here. This is a very good game, and I like it a lot. It's my favorite home version of the era. But if we look at some other games on the system, like Sega's Eternal Champions, which isn't a very good game, but it has huge characters, I think it's clear that we could have got something that looked a lot closer to the arcade release. I've always wondered what Genesis SF2 might have looked like had Sega done the home port themselves, as they did with those earlier games I talked about, like Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, Forgotten Worlds, and Mercs. I think with a huge cartridge capacity, Sega would have probably put out something quite different than the other home versions that we saw at the time. Still, we did get an excellent version of Street Fighter II that was similar to the versions on both the Super Nintendo and PC Engine. It had some benefits over the other versions, and some obvious deficits too, but there was a level of parity among the Street Fighter II games released for all of the major systems at the time. None of them took real advantage of the hardware they were on, but all still provided a fantastic version of one of the best games of all time. And on a related note, let's pretend that that inferior Super Street Fighter II for the Sega Genesis just never happened. Lastly, if you found this interesting and want to know more about the story of the prototypes of Street Fighter II for the Genesis, I suggest heading to the link I provided in the description to hiddenpalace.org that did a great write-up on the history of these games. So tell me folks, what do you think? Had you seen these prototypes in action before today? What is your favorite version of Street Fighter II for the Genesis now that you've seen a whole bunch of different ones? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. That's the only way my little channel here can grow. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through things like super thanks and channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.